Hello, everyone. I am really excited here because I get to have a conversation here on behalf of COM 26V with the three peacemakers of Mesvin, Sherry, and David, and Boston Greenfest. Bear with me, with Mr. Bailey. Boston Greenfest, Unifinity, Miranda Clendenning, David Gershon, Unify, The Creators 2030, Caroline Schwab, and everyone. So if I didn't mention you, I'm sorry, but we included everyone. And thank you for being such a part of this amazing event. So I have to just share a little bit about Mr. Bailey. He is quite amazing. So not only is he a filmmaker, photographer, inventor, and author, and designer, and builder, and entrepreneur who has a lot to share with us, he's a visionary, a really serious visionary and thinker in the realms of climate restoration and just the evolutionary potential of us as human beings. He's had degrees in literature, anthropology, mathematics, chemistry, and chemical engineering, and has lectured in mathematics and chemistry at the college level. He is the founder of Sacred Earth Enterprises, which is developing economically viable climate solutions. He is co author of the nonfiction book, The Trust Frequency, which I personally like, The 10 Assumptions for a New Paradigm, author of the historical mystery novel The Mayflower Revelations, and director of the films In Search of the Future and What Do the Wise Ones Know, and Seeds of Freedom, A Vision for America. Now, why have I read all that? It is not about everyone always a who's who, but it is when someone, and this is where I say elders are very important, not old, but elders upon which we can learn from. We can also share with them, but sometimes it's good to just sit back and listen to what elders have shared because there is a wisdom they have that they have lived that we have not. So we're going to get right into that as Mr. Andrew Bailey shares some quotes and thoughts on of others, which I think is really humbling that he's willing to share the quotes of others given his vast background. Mr. Bailey, would you take it away, please?
I will be happy to take it away, Gail. Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be here in this forum. Gail, you just named a list of some of my personal friends in the list there. And it's just an honor to be part of this extraordinary group of human beings. So here, just so you know, I'm not making this stuff up. Here's a little supporting evidence in the form of these three quotes. Firstly, climate restoration. This presentation is called Climate Restoration 101, the basics of climate restoration. Climate restoration is the job we have to do. Now, quote one, climate restoration is the urgent global endeavor to return Earth's climate systems to the safe and healthy state from which humanity and our natural world evolved. That quote was taken from the Healthy Climate Alliance. Quote number two, this is from the World Economic Forum report of last month. Food production and consumption has emerged as a macro-critical risk to global economic stability. If we want to achieve a resilient recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, avoid future pandemics, and stand a chance of delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, we must focus on food. That's, I think, interesting. That's, as I said, from the World Economic Forum, October 2020. And finally, from our colleague, Professor, author of End of Ice. He's a Cambridge University professor from the UK. And this is a brief little, but totally critical piece of information from Professor Wadhams. The goal of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade cannot be achieved simply by reducing carbon emissions. It requires us to actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So, contrary to many beliefs out there, it is not going to be sufficient. 50 years, 70 years ago, maybe. Had we stopped doing what we were doing, had we changed our behavior, had we stopped putting billions and billions of tons of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere every year, had we stopped then, we might have been able to change things. turn this ship around. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So we're faced with a job, and that job, that endeavor, is called climate restoration. It's very simply the job we have to do. Pope Francis just used the term just last month. That's pretty extraordinary. I believe Vice President-elect Biden just used the term in a speech 2 or 3 days ago. It is catching on. The term came to me from Peter Fikovsky, an extraordinary man, climate thinker, and the founder of a group called the Healthy Climate Alliance, of which I've been a member for about the last, I think it's been about 3 years. So, Gail, let's think about this. Those 3 quotes, and adding to that there's a very similar quote from the Pope himself. This is something that is finally getting some attention, getting some traction. What are your thoughts, Gail?
You know, I tell you, thank you for reading those very powerful quotes. I was really left with something about how climate is affecting our economy. That hit me right between the eyes because you see, there's been this thing, Mr. Bailey, where everyone wants to talk about climate, okay? They want to talk about things that are going on, but people, when they wake up in the morning, Mr. Bailey, they're not thinking about, oh, how can I go save the trees and the soil and this or that. They're thinking about, how am I going to make ends meet, especially in this COVID-19. They don't realize that there's a direct correlation to the climate that we're living in. They don't even see that COVID-19 has a lot to do with the strengthening of our planet so that we can continue to buy the produce in the stores that we have. We can continue to allow the soil that we're getting our food from to revitalize and restore itself. And how do we bring that to their attention when they get up in the morning? That the food that is sourced to you, that you're eating for your breakfast, is quite important to you. But I understand on the other side, most families are looking, even middle class, upper middle class, it doesn't matter. How am I going to continue to facilitate having my job and taking care of my family? These are basic things for the middle income. I'm not talking upper echelon, but for middle income, upper middle income, lower middle, and underserved areas, this is what they're thinking about on a daily basis. How are we going to eradicate poverty, which is one of my favorite things I know with David. And that's what hits me. Now, I understand the correlation, but I would love for you to understand, share with people how climate restoration, like from your climate restoration project and all the work you've done, how that correlates directly to that mother or that father waking up in the morning wondering how they're going to make ends meet, not realizing that the food they're buying for themselves from the soil, the fresh produce, okay, has everything to do with the climate.
All right, that's a big, big, big question, Gail. And I'd like you, if you would, call me Andrew. Last person who called me Andrew Bailey, who called me Mr. Bailey, was one of my students. We can't do that. Note I called you Gail. It doesn't even have your last name on there. So here's the question. I think the question really is, you've picked up on the middle one of those 3 quotes, the one to do with food, the one that emerged from the World Economic Forum. So the fact is that and then I'll do a brief overview of our situation and what we have to do to change it. Food, the way we currently produce and consume food, which includes delivering it thousands or sometimes tens of thousands of miles to hit your breakfast table, and it was grown in, who knows, Indonesia, and it got on a ship, and it got on a plane, and it got on a train and a truck, and ended up at the Hunters Point Market in New York City and was distributed back to where you live in Oklahoma. And that makes your food incredibly expensive on the one hand. Can you imagine that that is part of the cost of delivering that food to your family? And secondly, the sheer amount of fossil fuel that went into that project of putting a bowl of food in front of your kids. It's extraordinary. And I'm not saying this was done by a bunch of evil people who set out to do this, but it's a consequence of not really looking. It's really a consequence of the bottom line economy, the fact that we simply must make more money, and whatever makes the most money is going to win, and to hell with the consequences. So this is where we stand right now. Food, agriculture is one of the greatest contributors to global warming, to climate change, to irreversible damage on this beautiful planet of ours. We really do face a screaming emergency. It is a crisis. And honestly, I still don't hear the screaming. You would think we'd be hearing sirens. You would think that every leader of every country on the planet would be in emergency mode, getting this situation counted. I mean, I'm sitting here in Colorado. We've just come back to this beautiful 400-acre organic ranch called Sunrise Ranch. We were evacuated. An enormous fire came our way, got within 1,500 yards of the ranch, and we all had to get out of here and go somewhere else for a couple of weeks. And we're back, and it didn't burn, but the entire ranch was doused in ash and black soot. And this is the kind of future we face. I'll make a confession. I've been tracking this situation for 30 years, 40 years. Somewhere in the 70s, I woke up to what's going on. And we started out thinking, well, electric cars would help and recycling would help and all of those things would help. But the projections were telling us back then that the climate is going to get hotter and drier. And the hotter it gets and the drier it gets, the more it burns. And my confession is I never put two and two together and got the fact that we're going to be facing these incredible fires in places like Siberia. It's never seen a bushfire that I'm aware of. Australia, you're aware of what happened in the Australian summer two seasons back. You know what happened this year in California. It's completely extraordinary, and it's the very beginning of a total disaster. Because
yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Yeah. So what can we do about it? The big question is, what can we do about it? So to finish your point about how folks who have to feed their kids to become as conscious as we can, and with our dollar, even though we don't have many dollars these days, if with our dollars we can choose food that is locally grown and organic and healthy, we will save on healthcare costs. We will save on the diesel fuel required to produce that food because there won't be any required. We can do this. Our project, we work locally, we have a global vision, and we manifest it locally. We're in the process of creating these beautiful little organic farms that produce food right where you want it, right where it's consumed. And at the same time, we capture CO2 from Earth's atmosphere and do a whole bunch of other beneficial things, including providing jobs and on and on. That's a whole other story. So, Gail, shall I give a quick overview of our situation, followed by a sort of a summary of climate restoration and the three legs of that stool?
Well, Andrew, I actually think you should, because I think this is, and not to be funny with the public, I think this is very important information. Climate restoration is something that I study as a student of, and very, very important to me. So please, I think the public needs to know about it, understand it, connect with it, and take actions upon
it. So, let me preface it with this. We're at the end of 4 years, during which time the United States of America has, as the world's second largest polluter, has not only not done anything about climate, but has actually done the opposite. It has apparently made this decision that we are simply going to, as Americans, do as much as we can to make as much money as we can and take no notice of the consequences. We were in big trouble 4 years ago. We're in 10 times as big a situation right now. For anybody coming into the White House and any new administration is going to have extreme difficulty reversing what has been perpetrated on we the people. So it is a situation that has to be addressed immediately. The good news is that climate restoration not only is less expensive than it is being projected to be, it is actually a very practical thing for us to engage in. And it's not only going to be less expensive, it's going to be profitable. So when we started looking at this as a business opportunity that was described this year in February in Davos, Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum, it was described as a I wouldn't have dared to say this, but I didn't say it. They said it at the World Economic Forum. It is a multi-trillion-dollar investment opportunity. If that's true, and I believe it to be true, it's therefore going to happen. There's just no question that an opportunity of that magnitude, there's no way it's going to be ignored. So that's the very good news. And what we've been studying is, how do we actually make this profitable? How do we make this so an investor will be pretty much guaranteed significant return on investment? It's not a waste of money. I've heard people say, oh, it's going to cost 2% of gross domestic product and stuff like that. No, it's not, because the carbon in the atmosphere is a precious resource. That's the key to this whole thing. That CO2 is actually valuable. There's an estimated 1 trillion, between 1 and 2 trillion tons of the stuff in Earth's atmosphere, which means that it's right here in this room from which I'm speaking to you. It can be it can be extracted in small amounts or large amounts using very simple chemistry. I, by the way, I was a chemical engineer. I grew up in South Africa as a British boy who was born in England and was transplanted to South Africa. My dad was in the fertilizer business. He designed and built factories all over Southern Africa during something called the Green Revolution, which was when all of those chemicals left over from World War II were now put on fields throughout the world, and started the fertilizer industry. I grew up within that. That's what my dad did. At that time, nobody knew the long-term consequences. Excuse me. So that was a huge business opportunity, by the way, back then in the 1950s. And there's this new business opportunity. We can pull the CO2 out of Earth's atmosphere and turn it into a bunch of marketable products. There's at least 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different valuable products that can be created from CO2 in Earth's atmosphere. And it's everywhere. It's free for the taking. And you don't have to go to the moon to extract it. You don't have to go mining into Mother Earth, because it is simply, it's like the greatest mining opportunity of the last millennium. We could look at it that way. So that simply requires firing up. There are a lot of prototypes have been built. I could easily run off half a dozen companies right now that are successfully extracting carbon dioxide and doing certain things with them. I have a problem with the business model of many of those companies, because I look at the big picture. I say, okay, what is the net effect on climate? What is the net number of gigatons of CO2 that you're permanently extracting from the atmosphere? If you're extracting it and turning it into airplane fuel and selling it to be burnt again immediately, the answer is nothing, not 1 ounce, not 1 gram of carbon is permanently coming out of the atmosphere. And your operation has a very big carbon footprint. So tell me about the big picture. There are companies who are selling it to beverage industries because fizzy beverages like CO2. What happens to that CO2? Well, I heard about this guy who drank 10 of those beverages a day, and he did a lot of burping, just like the cows do a lot of burping. So I'm being sort of facetious here, but it's true. It's really important that and then there are operations that the plan is to pump the CO2 deep down into the earth, where it will react with the basalt and other rock formations down there and be permanently sequestered. That is probably going to help Earth's atmosphere. But when I ask those scientists, if I say, okay, now it's the next question, where is the return on investment? They look at me as though I'm crazy. And it's true, I am crazy. I think along channels that I'm not aware of too many other people who think the way we think in our little team. There's 8 or 10 of us. We're a small operation. We have yet to extract, and I must confess this, our first ton of carbon dioxide. We're still in the prototyping proof of concept phase. But we've been working on this for a long time. We've designed these systems. They're not big, ugly factories. So if we can do something that's attractive, that brings multiple benefits to communities, communities are going to like this. They're going to open up to them. And so we have both studied the potential and we've designed an operation. It's a global operation with local consequences everywhere we land. So it's kind of like going to war. You don't build a tank if you're going to go to war and a fighter plane. You set up a production line and you produce many of them, and then you deploy them. That is, we're following that model. So let's get back to climate restoration. The job is to restore Earth's atmosphere to the state it was in the pre-industrial era, when there was maybe 270, 280 parts per million of CO2 in Earth's atmosphere. Right now, we're above 415. We might be, if you include the methane, we might be at 450 equivalent. We're in very big trouble. That has never, ever happened in the history of this planet, at least while humans have been here on Earth. Okay, so we must do 3 things. Climate restoration consists of, in the most fundamental way, there are lots of spin-offs and lots of other, you could say, what about this, what about that? Yeah, but the 3 big things we have to do is, 1, yes, beloved Greta Thunberg, we do have to stop emitting CO2 into Earth's atmosphere. We must stop doing that, which means we must stop burning coal, oil, natural gas, all of those things. We actually have to stop doing that. We must do that. But as Professor Wadhams just said, it is not sufficient. We could stop everything right now, and we won't have changed anything whatsoever. We must stop, but it's not enough. Really important to know. Most people think, I'll drive an electric car and that'll solve the problem. Too late, too late, too late. But nevertheless, we still have to do that. Secondly, we must begin to extract as much CO2 from Earth's atmosphere, and let's include methane in that, because a lot of methane comes from fracking sites. A lot of methane is beginning to be released up at the Arctic. I'm not sure about the Antarctic, but up in the Siberian sea shelf, we're starting to see some very scary signs of methane that has been captured there for perhaps millions of years. And as the ice melts, this methane can be released, and it's many, many times, maybe 80 times or more powerful of a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. So we actually have to capture that methane, burn it, oxidize it so it becomes CO2, because we don't know how to permanently capture methane yet, or at least I don't. So we actually have to convert it to CO2, capture it as CO2. Once we start capturing, I'll give you a quick example. What can we do with CO2 from a chemistry standpoint? There's also lots of biological answers. Chemistry. Okay, I was probably 14 years old when I learned that if you took sodium hydroxide and bubbled carbon dioxide through it, you ended up with this neutral solution of something called sodium bicarbonate. It's baking soda. We're not going to go into the baking soda business, but the business of turning CO2 into baking soda, which is a precursor for a lot of other potential products, is one way to go. Very interesting technique is, instead of a sodium hydroxide, take a calcium hydroxide or a calcium oxide and turn that CO2 into calcium carbonate. Those of you with a little bit of chemistry behind you know that calcium carbonate is also known as limestone. limestone, marble. It's a rock. It's a very, very common rock on as part of Earth's crust. We can take that limestone and use it as aggregate for concrete. We can actually create the sand. Concrete consists of three different things. Cement, normally Portland cement. We need to replace that technology. Cement production contributes as much as 6% of the total CO2 going into Earth's atmosphere. We have to change that technology. But we no longer have to mine in Earth's crust for the aggregate, the rock, as part of the concrete, because we can actually manufacture that. We can make synthetic limestone. And I believe we can also make the sand, the finer, the little pebbles that form sand. We can make that with CO2 from the atmosphere. Concrete production is the single biggest thing, tonnage-wise, that humans manufacture and use every year. Trillions of tons of concrete that can permanently capture and sequester CO2 in Earth's atmosphere. Okay, so that's just a little glimpse of what we can do. That's the middle one. We must begin to extract CO2 and accelerate that rapidly, really rapidly. Can we do it in time? We don't know. Nobody's ever done this before. And finally, try this one. And this is not where I'm engaging, but our team knows how to do it. But this is I do not know where the return on investment is in this one. Maybe the return is we get a planet. That's huge. Can't put a price on that. We must refreeze the Arctic. We must restore the Arctic ice. And we must restore the Antarctic ice. And I'll throw into that finally something that's not often mentioned. We must restore our tropical forests. We hear a lot about the Amazon right now. It is being intentionally burned by the current government of the so-called country of Brazil. Something to do with the doctrine of discovery, and a Portuguese explorer landed there 400 years ago and stuck a pole in the ground with a flag on it. And now they think they have the right to do that. That's the lungs of planet Earth. And Africa has as well extraordinary forests, and Asia has as well these beautiful tropical forests that just are the most alive parts of our planet, and we are destroying them. We have to stop doing that. So that's my rant on that subject, Gail.
Sir,
Yep.
Andrew, that is not a rant. That's what we call in the community truth.
I agree with you. Thank you.
And it's funny because Peter was just talking about the limestone, and he was showing several of the synthetic pieces of the limestone when we were talking earlier today. No, dear, that is not what you call rant. Please don't call what you're speaking. No, really, honestly, please don't call what you're speaking as facts a rant, because it's where we are right now. It's what we're dealing with right now. It was really nice to see that both you and Peter, I've known Peter for a while, David's known you, and it's really nice to see this kind of conversation, versus understanding. People tonight should have gotten understanding of the difference between global warming and also climate restoration, because one, you're trying to fight to save it, okay? Another one, you're actually doing something about it with solutions to restore it. Big difference. And that's what creates a huge gap in it.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. So it's an extraordinary opportunity. It's actually the most fun I can imagine having, is designing and building and deploying these systems that will do this. I'm a grandfather. I have a grandson who I think he might be 2.5 weeks old. 2.5 weeks old. He has no idea how endangered this planet is. And I'd love it if he never found out.
I was just thinking that, Andrew, the other day, the youth that are 1 and 2 and 3, I hope that COVID is like completely erased. We're going in climate restoration mode heavily. And not just mode, we're actually doing something about it, so that 1, 2, and 3-year-old will never have to get to know it.
There you go.
So you were going to take us to another level with this. So please take us there.
To another level. Okay. So it seems to me that the best picture that I'm capable of painting is what our team has developed. Let me describe that briefly, because it covers most of the United Nations SDGs into a single integrated system, which is a design for a global company that does this job and at the same time provides everything from food to clean, healthy air to fireproof, safe refuge from out of control fires to to accommodation, to housing. We're going to have a whole bunch of climate refugees. We have ways to house them. We can actually, listen to this one, we can 3D print housing from carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We can create concrete and 3D print houses. There's a village in Mexico right now, that a little 50 unit village. That's an experimental, it's a company out of Austin, Texas, who have done that successfully. They're using traditional standard concrete. We simply replace the concrete. We source the concrete from the atmosphere. That in itself is a huge business, creating housing. As the oceans rise, we're going to be really challenged in terms of losing. Most humans live somewhere close to the coast, and countries like Bangladesh are going to disappear. They're going to be underwater. That's millions and millions of people who are in real trouble. What are we going to do? Well, so we can simply take this. Let me go back to 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement. That year, I met a gentleman named William Tooley, who, with his brother, had invented something that completely transforms agriculture. The way agriculture, so this is back to food, agriculture, the way livestock production is now done in the United States and in many places around the world, is in the so-called CAFO technology, which stands for, what is it called? What is it again? CAFO, the confined animal feeding operation, okay? And when you're driving from Berkeley down to LA, for example, and that horrific stench hits you on Route 5, it's because you are driving past or through a CAFO. They are horrific. They're so unhealthy, they require all of these antibiotics in the feed for the animals, on and on. This is a form of CAFO that's completely organic. It transforms it completely and takes that stinky stuff known as animal waste, which is either just dropped onto the ground or kept in so-called manure lagoons, and transforms that so-called waste. Remember, there's no such thing as waste in the universe. The waste CO2 in the atmosphere is not waste, it's a resource. The animal waste, the livestock waste, all those pigs and hog operations down in the Carolinas, where the hurricanes come and this filthy stuff starts washing through the streets. That is actually a precious resource, and Bill Tooley and his brother invented a technology that transforms it into crystal clear, odor-free, toxin-free organic fertilizer that can be either sprayed directly on farm fields or delivered using subsurface irrigation. That's how this began. I met this gentleman. I went, oh man, this is amazing. Are you telling me we can actually transform that entire industry? And he said, absolutely. And I said, what's the problem? He says, well, it costs some money to there are 31 or 32 farms in the Midwest right now using the technology. I'm a filmmaker. I've been there. I've interviewed, I've filmed the farmers. I've said, how's it going? They said, it's amazing. I said, to the wife, I said, what's the first thing you noticed? She said, the stink went away. They have a pig operation. Their neighbors downwind said, oh, you guys aren't doing hogs anymore. They said, yeah, we are. They said, no, you're not. The smell, there's no smell. She said, yeah, you noticed, huh? Her kids go to school. They used to go to school and stink so bad that nobody could come near them at a school in South Dakota, where I think it was South Dakota. The smell went away, and the smelly waste turned into a valuable fertilizer, an organic fertilizer that could be either sold to the neighbors who were growing livestock feed or used on their own farm. And that just depends on how you choose to use it. It eliminates the need for chemicals. It basically eliminates the whole Monsanto Bayer chemical industry. You no longer need them. It's an alternative to that. So then the question was, okay, so how did you manage to do this? And they said, well, we're fortunate. Unlike our neighbors, we had enough money to be able to afford to do this. Okay, what's the problem with the neighbors? They can't afford it. And so, okay, Mr. Tooley has this incredible operation, but he has not been able to get it off the ground other than he got a USDA grant to build 11 of them. That was nice. And about another 20, I think, farmers actually had the resources to do it. But most farmers don't have those resources. The banks won't lend. They'll only lend on chemical fertilizers and pesticides and on and on. And that's the situation. That's to do with vested interest and an industry that's very powerful and lobbies, and the banks just have to say yes, sir, yes, sir. So that's how I got started with this. And then as I personally started to get into, well, too much CO2 in Earth's atmosphere. Speaking as a chemist, that doesn't sound like too much of a problem. What does CO2 react with? The answer is a lot of things. So, okay, it's not at all difficult, let's put it that way, to come up with ideas for reacting atmospheric CO2 in a chemical manner and capturing it and keeping it. And then the challenge is to then turn it into something of value, because then you have return on investment. And I always knew that it was possible to somehow intuitively, how do these two things come together? We've got this livestock thing. I'm a vegetarian. I'm not actually one who is going to kill and eat those animals. On the other hand, I recognize that it is very widespread. Even China now, their rate of beef consumption is going through the roof. So if we can produce meat in a way that's kinder to the animals, that's kinder to the earth, that cuts down on the emissions and the off-gassing that's coming from these farms that are causing downwind. You know, where Chicago is, it's downwind from a whole bunch of livestock production. And that is really bad for the health of elders and children. We have an epidemic of asthma. We have an epidemic of emphysema. Those things are caused, at least in part, by the way we produce livestock meat. So combining those two things into something now called the Enviroplex that includes meat, livestock production. My perspective is I want that fertilizer, because with that organic fertilizer, I can replace the chemicals. And it includes carbon capture, which is my personal, that's what keeps me awake at night, just designing these systems. And that's where we stand, Gail. We're at the very beginning of a very big industry.
Well, I thank you so much, because you've answered a lot of questions for me. You know, I'm a complete nerd, but I'm a nerd who likes to take action. So it's a different type of nerd.
It's a good kind of nerd. I like nerds, by the way.
Yes, I'm very nerdy. I have no problem with that. Well, I thank you, sir, so much for it's not just insight, but insight that provides actions.
Yep, get our boots on the ground, get our hands dirty, and get organic again, and restore a planet for our children and our grandchildren. That's the job.
Very much so. You know, it was funny during COVID, when COVID first started. So there are times that I go on my veins where I love to cook every day. Okay, you know, for my family, for myself. I'm a new school girl, but I'm an old school girl too. And there was the other side of it where I saw all these people during COVID getting cans of food. And so I'm a holistic person. I have a holistic nutritionist for the last X amount of years, over 20 years. So I'm into organic all the way. And so is my colleagues that I work with. So I do float between vegan and pescatarian at times.
Yeah, me too.
Exactly. So I was talking to someone, they said, why are you picking up produce? I said, COVID is not in your produce. But that crap that you're eating right there, you'll wish you had COVID, because all of the salt content. And one of the things that really bothers me, I live in a very nice neighborhood, okay? And I say that very humbly. I'm very blessed, okay? I live in the urban side of New York, New Jersey area. So it's like New York's sixth borough. And on one side, you can have high rises, and the other side, you have a parks, and the other side, you have your brownstones. Okay. And it gives you a little bit of the best of both worlds. But one thing that really bothers me is that, you know, when you get organic food, okay, the organic food is a lot more money, okay, than the regular food. And so I went to a neighborhood, I guess you could say like a Walgreens. And when I walked in, the whole refrigerator, Andrew, I looked at the back of the salt content because that night I didn't feel like cooking. So it said, okay, organic frozen dinner. It said organic. I said, okay, let me see this to believe it. On the back, the salt content was through the roof. Okay. The preservatives were through the roof. I said to myself, I'm better off getting McDonald's, and I haven't eaten McDonald's in years,
Right.
than I am buying this organic, so called organic frozen dinner. And what got me is that people, who come through from the mass transportation, who are on their way home, okay, picking up all of these things, that I'm watching them. And it's usually people of color, it's usually Hispanic, it's usually indigenous. They're picking up all of these foods laced with salt because they're not educated, not because they're not educated themselves, because we don't educate the average person about the importance of produce that actually is cheaper than the frozen food you just bought. And so I said, I had a conversation with the young lady there. She said, "Oh my God, I didn't know." And she looked back and she said, "My mother suffers from high blood pressure." And I was about to give this to her. I said, "Do you like to cook?" She said, "I love to cook." I said, "You want to know something quick? Why don't you go get some fresh organic spinach, some red onions. Maybe they're not organic, but you can wash them off with some lemon, and some rice and fresh tofu that's $1.50. That could be your dinner for the night." She added it up, and I saw her as I was walking home. She said, "Do you know that cost me $4 less?"
Yeah. So food is critical. As we think about, people say, "Oh, organic's expensive." What if it saves you or your society billions of dollars of avoidable healthcare expenses every year? That's the difference. There's this whole so-called healthcare. It's not a healthcare, it's a sick care industry. That's a multi-billion dollar or multi-trillion dollar industry. And we can let that go. We don't have to do that. We do have to change our behavior as humans.
Absolutely. And I just thank you so much for your time. It was amazing talking with you, Andrew, learning
Oh,
so much.
thank you. And by the
Yes.
way, I raised my kids in New York, out in Eastern Long Island, and most of them are still there. And I come to New York a lot. I love New York. I'm a New York. I've lived in Manhattan for a total of, I think, 12 years. Then I moved out to the country when we started having kids. And love it, love it, love it. We want to do one of our early enviroplexes up the Hudson River Valley. So that's
My favorite area too, because I usually,
Yeah.
what is it called? Not Beacon, but all the way up in Fishkill.
Fishkill.
Yes. There's
I met my wife at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, so I've got a long history in that part of the world.
Yes, yes. I met Jane Fonda there. I met
Oh, there you go.
people. But there's a farm called the Sugar Maple Farm, owned by Walter Cascal. I think he used to own part of the Waldorf Astoria. And so we used to sneak onto his farm, okay? When we were kids, you're going to laugh. We used to sneak into his farm. I love horses. So I would jump on the back of a thoroughbred, not knowing it was a thoroughbred. And I was taught to ride by my father's side of the family that's Native Indian. And I would jump. So one day he caught us. He said, "Why don't I just give you the code to come back here and just ride?" And why do I share that? There is something to, and this is what, when we say that we want to generate a lot of money, I want to generate a lot of money in the billions, not millions, for one reason only: to give people access to that. To be
Yeah.
able to take off in a horse, to be able, and he had a pond on his property, and he had apple trees, apple groves, pumpkin groves, things like that. And he used to tell us, just come and take as many apples as you want. It wasn't a handout at all, Andrew. It was more, because we all lived up in the area, but it was more or less like, my family's from North Carolina, from the farm country. And it felt like my great grandfather's not ranch, but his farm again. Because he kept a very clean farm, and we used to have fresh eggs and all of that stuff. It was a different type of thing. And so yeah, it was just what a lot of things you shared reminded me of those times.
Yeah. Hey, Gail, let's find a way to communicate. Can I give you my email right over the call here?
No. I will. We can do that offline, because
Okay.
you might have might have a few nuts.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, this is true.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some, especially with Zoom lately. So yeah.
Oh,
But
yeah. We got Zoom bombed once.
Yeah. Oh, we did too, and I will not talk about what we saw.
Oh, yeah.
let's just say we saw some things that we didn't think existed to man. But
Yeah.
if you would just be with us for 1 second, Andrew, as we put you in the green room.
Okay.
And we thank everyone for listening. This is something you want to go back and rewind, and then rewind again. Because in order to learn something and have it implemented, it takes 21 days to gain a habit. And you want this to be habit forming. Trust me, you're not going to get a lot of information on climate restoration. You will get it on global warming, ending the climate crisis as it relates to global warming, but not as climate restoration. So I think it's very important that you really take the advisement of people like Mr. Bailey. I know it's from the South. I'm sorry. People like Mr. Bailey, who's actually taken the time and devoted many of years of his life to this. This is where we need to honor our elders. This is where we need to learn from our elders and share our knowledge with them, so you can bring your knowledge together. It's about all of us working together with each other, not the future, but now. So just hold on with us 1 second, Andrew.